we get ourselves in our own way. And I was thinking to myself, the message was more important to me than the fear. And when the message becomes more important than the fear that we have within, that's when we know that we're operating from a place of alignment and service and what we're meant to put out into the world.
Welcome to An Entrepreneur's Vibes, the podcast that gives insight into the minds of visionary entrepreneurs and business leaders. Brought to you by The Right Direction, a leading professional and technical writing company based in North America. Each episode, we explore stories and experiences of those who dared to dream, took the leap, and built their own empires. Join us in uncovering the secrets to success and lessons learned along the way. So if you're just starting out your entrepreneurial journey or you're already a seasoned business pro, you'll find inspiration, knowledge, and good vibes right here. Today, we are thrilled to announce a new esteemed guest. She is a multifaceted entrepreneur, renowned podcast producer, and visionary CEO of Vault Productions. With a passion for amplifying voices and spreading inspiration, she has carved a remarkable path in the world of podcasting. Her journey began with the creation of her own podcast, Happiness Happens, in 2018. And through this platform, she has not only shared her own wisdom, but has provided a stage for industry leaders to impart their valuable insights on achieving fulfillment and success. Join us as we explore her journey and the insights she has to offer aspiring entrepreneurs. And welcome to the show, Simona Costantini. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
We're so excited. You're like the first podcast host we've had on the show. Usually I'm like used to having this setup, but it's so exciting to have someone like, have a similar setup and it's like a pro in the industry. So I'm so excited to have you today.
Oh, that makes me feel so good. And I have to say, if you're watching this, normally my set is way different than this. I just moved and I'm still getting the whole vibe down, but it's okay. It'll do.
Our audio listeners are having a blast though, because
Perfect.
everything sounds amazing. Well, can you share with us how you initially got involved in the podcasting industry and what sparked your interest in this medium?
Okay, that is such a good question. And I truly feel like the podcasting industry landed in my lap. I never thought that I would be a podcaster, let alone a podcast producer. When I first started my podcast, Happiness Happens, back in end of 2018, beginning of 2019, it came out of just a really dark time of my life. And so when I started that show, you know, you know what it's like when you start something and then just doors start to open and you don't really know how or why they start to open, but they do. And so my journey into being a producer and working in the podcast space was from my love of podcasting. And I just had, a Fiverr profile and I would edit for people and do their podcasts. And then I decided to take the leap. I worked in corporate, I worked in marketing and PR, communications and all that. And this was all during, the time when the world shut down and before that. And I ended up working for this really cool company. It was a real estate company. And I learned a lot about client experience when I worked there. And as I worked there, I ended up buying a house. It was about 2 hours away from where my job was. They wouldn't let me work in the office, like work outside of the office. I had to be in the office every day. So I was like, you know what? This is the time. Like the time is now or never. I really feel like we're given different opportunities and different times in life to take leaps. And sometimes you just have to take them. And so I did. I was like, well, I'm moving and let me see what happens. So I took my Fiverr business. I contacted all of my clients and I said, hey, I'll give you a better rate if you come with me direct. And you're not supposed to do that, but it's okay. Sometimes we just break a few rules to sort of make our own path as long as it feels aligned. But yeah. And then I started, editing for people one-on-one, and then they would send me different referrals. And then I was like, hold on, like, I think I've got something here. And I launched podcast launch services in March of 2021, booked out in 72 hours with 5 new launches and literally have not stopped since. It's just grown and grown. And yeah, now I get to do this every day with my team of 3. And we work with primarily women entrepreneurs, health, wellness, marketing, digital marketing, parenting spaces. So yeah.
Wow, that sounds
It's a
really
journey.
that journey sounds like really scary, but now
It
that you
was.
speak about it, it's like so exciting as well. But
Yeah.
could you share with us some of the challenges you faced when starting your podcast and even the production company? And how did you overcome that?
Love that. So when I started the podcast, I think the biggest challenge was fear of judgment and fear of being seen. And it's actually something that I see all the time, a lot of the time with the clients that we work with now. And it makes sense because you're being seen in a totally different way. You're showing up to the mic with different thoughts and perspectives. And those thoughts and perspectives may not be what your friends or family are used to talking about, right? And so it's kind of like this push to a different identity within yourself. And so that for me was like one of the most scary things, because I was talking about topics that my family had no idea that I was even interested in. And so I had to overcome that piece first, because that part is what holds you back in all of the other areas too, right? Like we say that the tech is so hard and so complicated, but it's not really. It's like we get ourselves in our own way. And so it was getting out of my own way and back into the path that I wanted to be on. And I was thinking to myself, the message was more important to me than the fear. And when the message becomes more important than the fear that we have within, that's when we know that we're operating from a place of alignment and service and what we're meant to put out into the world. So that was the biggest challenge, was overcoming that internal fear and fear of judgment and fear of being seen in a different way. But it pays off. It really, really does. And yeah, I'll stop there.
And you're also the host of a second podcast as it relates to
Yes.
podcasting. When did you establish this,
Yes.
and how does that differ from Happiness Happens?
Yeah. So Happiness Happens is a podcast where I interview experts and entrepreneurs and thought leaders in the world of happiness to understand what happiness means to them, but also why we crave it so much and why we feel like we don't have it. And so that podcast was an extension of my desire to help one other person in this world feel less alone and feel validated in their journey and who they are. That show launched at the beginning of 2019, end of, 2018. Then as I started the production company, I started to realize that people have a lot of questions about podcasting. And most specifically, how do I grow a podcast? How do I take my podcast and, make a big impact with it? How do I get more downloads and more listeners? And how do I use these specific marketing tools, things like Pinterest or paid ads, TikTok, YouTube, right? How do I do all of that when the information can feel so confusing? So I started, as it relates to podcasting, with the desire for that show to be a response or like an answer to people's questions, right? So if you want to learn how to use Pinterest for your podcast, the way that I do these episodes is in 4-part series. So I bring on one particular co-host every single month, which is different than Happiness Happens, because every week on Happiness Happens, I have a different guest. So I bring on different co-hosts every single month, and we deep dive into one specific topic related to the industry. So 1 month specifically will be Pinterest. 1 month will be paid ads. 1 month will be brand sponsorships or guesting or whatever. And so you can go and you can take a listen to that whole entire series, and it leaves you with more tangible things than just, what's covered in a 40-minute interview, because you can't really get into the nitty-gritty sometimes in 40 minutes. But in this show, you do. So that's the biggest difference between the two of them, is this like co-host vibe versus just interviewing guests.
Wow, I think that's like so interesting. And I feel like a lot of
Thanks.
people really like learn from you through listening to that podcast, especially now that I feel like
Yeah.
everyone, has like gotten a mic, and whether they're just like a celebrity or whether they're like an internet celebrity person or they have a business, they've started using podcast as a medium to market their brand. So I think this is a really great way to learn if you're starting from
Exactly.
scratch. And how would you say podcasting impacted your professional and personal life since you started?
Oh my goodness, it changed my entire life. I never anticipated where I would be today. I really didn't. I always knew that I wanted to work for myself, but I never knew what that would be in, or what that would be what I would be doing in this space. From a like personal side, it changed my confidence. It transformed the way I see the world. It allowed me to look at different perspectives and really see things from a different lens. And also, too, we don't have to dive too far deep into this, but last year in 2023, I went through a divorce, and having my podcast was one of the key reasons why I was able to stay positive through that process, or, look to the bright side when it kind of felt impossible, because it's really hard to stay sad and to stay upset and to stay angry when you're interviewing people about happiness every single week. You know what I mean? So it's been a constant mindset reframe. And in every episode, it's something I can take something away from it. And then on a professional side, I mean, I went from working in corporate, and in the first year that I was in business, I exceeded my corporate salary. Like, that's nuts. It was so crazy. And I never thought that that would actually be a possibility for me to go out and to do something on my own and create something for myself and help people every single day. Like, on a professional level, I mean, I get to speak on stages now. I get to come on podcasts now. I get to launch new programs and, help and serve different podcasters. So, like, it's a complete 180 from where my life used to be, but it also feels in total alignment with where I'm supposed to be,
That's really amazing. And I'm so happy that you found
Thanks.
that alignment for you. And probably someone
Thanks.
out there right now is listening and wanting to be on that same path. So, besides getting over the fear of judgment and the fear of getting seen, could you walk us through the process of creating and launching a successful podcast?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, absolutely. So I will say what I'm going to share right now, I pull from, and I can send you the link to it afterwards. But I have like a free launch guide that I developed because I get, asked this all the time. And so in that guide, it's a checklist of everything that I'm going to share with you. But essentially, one of the biggest pieces that I always like to start with is your mission statement for your show. What is it that you're creating? Why are you creating it? Why should your listener care? Right? So, like, what are you creating? Who's it for? What are they going to learn? And why should they care? And then from there, you can use that to create your intro script, outro script, trailer, show description, right? Those are fundamental things that you need. And then you need to sort out your equipment. So what kind of mic and what kind of headphones do you want? What kind of editing software do you want? And what kind of recording software do you want? And then even more than that, once you have all those pieces, then you can sit down and you can record, right? And I'm really simplifying it because it actually isn't that complicated. It's just putting all these things together. So once you have your intro, your outro, your trailer, and your show description, you can then sit down, you record with your mic and your headphones on your recording software, and you just start. Right. And then you can bring on guests if you want to do guest interviews, and you can record those as well. And then you start editing your content. So you edit your content. And I like to, while you're editing your content, I like to at the same time create like a launch plan, like a social media marketing plan, right? Because we need to figure out, like, how are we going to launch this podcast? Who's going to be listening? What platforms are we using to launch it? Are we using TikTok? Are we using LinkedIn? Are we doing Pinterest, right? Are we on Instagram? How are we leveraging email marketing? All of those different components, like, are really important when it comes to your whole launch process. So that's how I would say to get started. Like, figure out what your mission is, write your scripts, figure out your tech, sit down to record, but then also figure out your production schedule. So what does your production schedule look like? What is being released and when? And this will allow you to stay ahead of your episodes so that you're not constantly going, like, every single week being like, what's being released this week? What am I doing this week? What
Scrambling.
questions yeah, exactly. So those would be my recommendations to start.
Yeah, I totally understand being overwhelmed. And I feel like not just with podcasting, starting anything can be very, very overwhelming, but it's all about just
Yeah,
like compartmentalizing and like planning out the steps. And then when you lay out all the steps, it becomes easier to follow. So I think that's like so
exactly.
amazing what you've just shared. And you have a diverse background. You
Mhm.
have your studies in media, public relations, and you were also in digital marketing. How has that contributed to the success of your podcast and your entrepreneurship in general?
So I feel like having that diversity in my background allows me to understand marketing from a different lens, because that's what I worked in, and like that's what I did day in and day out, and communications and client experience and PR and coverage and all of those things. So it's allowed me to bring a really unique perspective to my clients, because I understand the production side, but I also understand the SEO side and the strategy side, right? And I also understand listener habits and what will make a show good, right? And how to dial in on your messaging, how to get your branding just right as well. All of those pieces are marketing, right? How to use colors together, the fonts that you want to use together. Like, there's so many different pieces that I draw on from my past experience, but marketing is way more than just social media. Like you have online marketing for sure, and you have social media, but it's so much more than that, right? Like you have social media marketing, but then you also have, blogs, you have newsletters, you have email funnels, you have things like Pinterest, which I don't really consider like full social media because it's a search engine. Then you have YouTube, right? And you have how do we leverage transcripts, and how do we leverage the guests, and how all of those pieces, they're all marketing, all of them. And so online marketing is one piece of the puzzle, but what do we do about paid ads, right? What do we do about all of those other things? And so I think that having all of that experience in the past, because I've done so much different stuff. Like I've done like product launches for a seating manufacturing company, and like learning what goes into that, and like the nitty gritty, and like how to make something come to life from nothing. That is like that there's like a secret in there, you know what I mean? That's the way that you get things into the universe, into the world, right? So yeah.
Well, in your experience, do you think it's important to have like formal education or formal experiences when establishing your own podcast or just being in the creative industry, for example?
I think definitely understanding the basics of marketing will help you. I don't think you need to like go to school for marketing to market a podcast, but I think knowing and understanding the impact that platforms like TikTok, YouTube Shorts, Facebook, like all of those things still have, LinkedIn, like Pinterest, all of that. It's important to like understand it, but I also don't think that you need to have formal training in it, because there's a lot of stuff that you can learn. But I think that one thing that I see a lot of is people are like, okay, well, I'm just going to launch the podcast and I'll do the marketing after. But it's like understanding that the marketing of your show actually is part of the show, and it's part of your listeners' experience, right? Because people need to see something quite a few times before they take action on it, right? So okay, you have your podcast and you just put your episode out, but if you don't understand anything about marketing or how to leverage that episode and put it out there, then you are missing a whole category of people. If you don't understand how catchy titles work, and what's working on YouTube or whatever, wherever your podcast is, you're missing out on audience share, right? And then somebody else will come and get that. So I don't think you need formal training in it, but I think you need to understand it. And I think you also need to be constantly keeping up to date with that, and also with AI technologies and all of it. It like the world is changing and it changes fast. And so the more you can stay up to date with everything that's going on, I just think that you create a better experience for yourself and a better experience for your listener.
Yeah, I think the creative industry is definitely more fast paced, especially
Yeah,
it's a lot based on like trends as well. So you just have to be like willing to adapt when you get into this type of like creative industry. Well,
exactly.
could you yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I just want to add in like what we were talking about before, like the fear of judgment and being seen and all of that. It also happens on social media. And I mean, I even get like that. Like, I'm like, oh, I don't want to go on my stories, or I don't want to create a TikTok, or I don't want to do whatever. But then it's like, if you think about what's behind all of that, it honestly, people are not judging you. You know what I mean? Like people are not judging you. Like no one is judging you the way that you're judging yourself, first of all. And also, people want to consume content, right? Like look at how much time people spend on TikTok. So instead of consuming it, why not be the one that creates it? Right. And I think that when you can start to like look at it differently, that okay, so you're gonna put a video out and maybe it's gonna suck, but then maybe the next 10 will be really good. And then you never know what's gonna happen. Like I have friends and they make well over 10K a month just in brand deals, you know? So it's possible. It happens. But you just have to try. You just have to try because you never know.
And with that, like, was there any like exercise you did? Because I mean, it's easier said than done, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, just get over it. Like, just do it. But it's not always that easy. Like, going against your internal monologue of like, oh, people are gonna like this is so cringy, for example. Like you can get those kinds of thoughts. Like, I know it's like a long like process to say that you've gotten over that fear of judgment and the fear of being seen. But what was that process like for you? Like,
You
what exactly did you do?
I feel like I'm still doing it like every single day. Like even when we got on our interview today, I apologized to you because I don't have makeup on. Like that's like a thing for me. Like I don't like to show up on camera when I don't have makeup on, but I'm also not someone who does my makeup every single day, right? I like to let my skin breathe. Like I like to do all of this stuff, right? But so I've created this story in my mind that I can't show up on social media when I don't have makeup on. So then I never show up on social media. You know what I mean? Like if I post content, it's typically from my podcast or, it's typically from, something else that we're creating or like B-roll content or whatever. So that said, if you don't like being on, camera and like facing the camera or whatever, is there a world where you can create content from a B-roll perspective where you're just taking a video of yourself doing something so that you're not fully in the camera and you have a voiceover and you have, text on your screen and call it a day? But things that I've done to get over that is honestly, I will caveat and say, like, I feel like I still have to get over that every single day and I still have to like hype myself up. But at the end of the day, I remind myself people are not sitting there being like, oh my God, look at her. You know what I mean? Look at this is such a stupid thing that she said, or like, this is so dumb that she did this, or look how she looks like this. Like, honestly, people don't care. But then also just realizing that the message that you have to share is so much more important than the way you look, right? It really, really is. And you can change so many people's lives by just sharing your message. So if you don't like being on camera, find a different way where you can still get your message across. Like there's so many like faceless YouTube channels, faceless TikTok accounts, and all of these things that people do that get the message that they want to get across without having to pull themselves too far out of their comfort zone. But I would also challenge you to just to actually just try it. And I hate when people give me that advice, like just do it, because it's like, hey, it's easier said than done. But figure out where that story is coming from, right? What is that story in your mind? What's it telling you that you can and cannot do? Is it serving you or is it holding you back? And is it a story that you actually want to keep having for the rest of your life? You know?
Yeah.
If the answer is yes, then okay. And then if the answer is no, then you have your answer.
Yeah, I think it's all about just reframing your mindset. The thoughts you say to yourself become your
Yeah.
reality. So just
Yeah.
practice saying better thoughts, like affirming
Mm,
thoughts. To That's really great advice. I'm gonna try that out because even
yeah.
I have sometimes like I get through those anxieties as well. So, but I wanted to talk about your the Vault Productions company. Could you share with
Yeah.
us the unique value propositions that your company offered to clients seeking podcast production and consulting services?
I love that question. So, Volt Productions is a rebrand. It's brand new in 2024. We just rebranded the agency. It was previously under my name, and I have big plans for the agency. So, I wanted to have like a really like strong, cool brand behind it. And really, what you're getting with Volt Productions is a team of people that care about your podcast. Just like I care about your show just as much as I care about my show. And so we look at everything through that lens. It's very hands on. I work directly with all of the clients. And then I have an incredible team that I've built over the last few years that are specialized in their specific areas. So you have someone who's specifically dialed into what looks good from a branding perspective and social media templates. You have someone who's dialed in on video editing, pulling clips, writing show notes. Like, it's very targeted. And it's also, I put a lot of care into everything that we craft. And we don't just create just to create, we create with intention. And so that's the difference. Like you're not just getting like a run of the mill podcast production agency that's just going to, pay to have your episodes produced and then they don't care. There's a lot of care that goes into it. And there's a lot of love that goes into it. And when each show feels like my very own, like there's a lot of, yeah, I don't know. There's just a lot of I feel like there's a lot of power in that because you're getting more than just a producer, but like you're getting someone who's partnering with you in your brand, in your own vision, in your own mission, in your own message. And so we work together as a team and we fully integrate ourselves into it sounds pushy, but it's not. We integrate ourselves into what it is that you're creating. And then we figure out how does the podcast fit amongst all the other things that you're doing. How does the podcast fit and serve your audience in the best possible way while also supporting the business that you're creating too?
And how would you say Vault Productions differ from any other podcast production companies in terms of quality, innovation, and customer experience?
Love that. I'll start with customer experience. So customer experience is something that's really important to me. I've learned over my years in corporate how important it is for people to feel like they're a part of something bigger, but also feel like they are being cared for on a soul level. And so with the customer experience, that for me is such an important piece. I, make sure that I'm the one taking the client calls, that I'm the one who's doing all of the onboarding stuff. Those are not things that I want to like hand off to somebody else to do. So making sure that my client feels cared for and valued is really, really, really important to me. So that's the first piece. The quality side of it, I mean, we take great care in making sure that each episode is edited really, really well. And not even like over editing and like removing all of the things, but like making sure that, it's not being cut off. Like an episode isn't being cut off in the middle of someone's breath. You know what I mean? Where it's like sometimes it can be a rough cut. And I spend a lot of time helping my clients like set up their studios, set up their mics, making sure their sound sounds good and all of the above. And so when you take the time to do that, like the quality of the product that you're going to put out there naturally just is really, really good. But that also goes for the graphics, making sure that everything is, on trend, but even more than just on trend. Like what is coming up? How do we change the industry? How do we do something different, right? How do we do it in a different way? And then how do we take those, different graphics? How do we create a social media strategy that makes sense? So there's a lot of different stuff that goes into it. And so I think those are the key things that set us apart. But I think the biggest thing that sets us apart is that the agency is built off of my own personal values. And my top 3 values are kindness, care, connection. Those are my top 3 values in life. If it doesn't have kindness, care, and connection, I don't want it. And so I won't do it in my agency either. So we lead every conversation with kindness, care, and connection. We lead every single challenge, you know, so on from that. I'll give you an example. Earlier this week, I was editing a podcast episode for a new client, and we had a miscommunication on something, and something needed to be changed with the audio, and it needed like a whole entire re-edit. So instead of charging my client again for a re-edit, even though I should have probably, I didn't. Not because I don't feel like I'm not worthy of the cost, but because it's a new client and I value the client relationship the most, and we both learned. So things are always a learning experience. And so how do you take those learning experiences and then implement them in a really, I don't know, aligned way? And so she walked away from that being super, super happy. And I walked away from that also being super happy because it was done to the best possible way that it should have been? So
Mhm.
that quality piece is really important.
I really admire the way you just like handle your business ethics. And I
Thank
mean, we're
you.
talking about kindness, care, and connection, and that leads to
Yeah.
happiness. I wanted to talk more about happiness happens actually. Could you tell
Yeah.
us about the ethos of happiness happens and what did you want to aim and achieve with each episode?
So when I first started Happiness Happens, I was mentioning to you before that it came out of like a really interesting time of my life. So, you know, I felt like I was alone in the thoughts that I had and the feelings that I had, and like, was going through life. I felt isolated, but it was so weird because I was so surrounded by people. And it's a really interesting thing being someone who is generally more positive in life and then having feelings of unhappiness or sadness or fear or whatever else that feeling or emotion is. And being told by other people that it's like, but you're the happiest person I know. So like, how could you have all of those emotions? And that was like something that people would tell me all the time. And so when I started the podcast, it was kind of like a personal journal of everything that I was learning. I was in therapy and I was like learning all these things. And I was like, hey, like you need to hear these things too. And then it created the mission, the ethos, the basis for the whole show, which is helping one person feel less alone. If I've helped one person feel less alone in their thoughts, in their emotions, in their feelings, in what they experience on a day to day, and make sure people feel and know that they are part of something bigger than what's going on in this moment right now, I feel like I've done my job. And we get to do that every single week for thousands and thousands of people, which is really, really cool. And to get to do that and have that continue to be the mission that drives the podcast years later, I think is super powerful, especially when you think about how alone people feel in a day to day. People don't feel like they're heard or understood. They don't feel like they're seen. They feel like, the black sheep of their family. They feel like their, parents, family, friends don't understand them. And then throw on a dream of being an entrepreneur on top of that. And it's like, oh my God, like, what are you doing with your life? Like, why would you do that? And so it can feel isolating and it can feel alone. And so it can feel lonely, sorry. And I just really wanted people to feel like they found their place when they listened to the show. So that's ultimately what it is at the end of the day.
I think that's so needed. I feel like it's so weird because, like,
Thanks.
with social media, it feels like you're so connected, but not necessarily. It doesn't feel like a genuine
Yeah.
connection. You're constantly like seeing everyone's stories, like finding out what everyone else is doing. But it's just like it does feel like a genuine connection, so I feel like that
Yeah.
podcast is, like, really important. I feel like a lot of people, maybe some of our listeners need that right now, so definitely
Yeah.
plugging your podcast in our description down below. I definitely would need that and would love to binge on some of your episodes after we speak. But,
Yeah.
we were talking earlier about, like, scrambling to get, like, guests or, like, finding out what your next episode is gonna be. How do you go
Yeah.
about selecting industry-leading guests for your podcast, and what criteria do you consider when inviting them?
So I make sure that all of the guests actually like their message actually aligns to the podcast episode and then sorry, to the podcast and then vice versa. I feel very lucky with Happiness Happens because the show's been around for so long and it's like more, I think like when you go on to the podcast players and you search for a show about happiness or self-worth or whatever, and Happiness Happens comes up and it's been around since 2018. I get a lot of pitches for the podcast, which is great. But then, I have to go in and like dig in and make sure that the person's like message aligns. What are they like when they speak? I also have a little bit of like a, online brand perspective to it as well. Like I want to make sure that the people that I'm bringing on are going to be just as excited about the episode as I am. And they're going to want to share the episodes because like that's so important. It's not the only way to grow your podcast, but it's definitely like a way to grow your podcast is making sure that your guests are sharing and tapping into their own audiences and stuff too. And then if I'm thinking about it from like a client perspective, and booking guests for their shows. So what I do is I have like a spreadsheet that I open up in front of me. I put down a whole bunch of podcasts. I just do a whole bunch of research, keywords, like all kinds of stuff. I'll put them into the podcast apps, check and make sure that, okay, this is more for getting on other podcasts, but I'll give you that tip too, because I'm sure someone would want that. So making sure that the podcast episodes are still active, like still publishing new episodes. And then I put them all in a spreadsheet. You can get yourself booked on more podcasts and then booking guests on my client podcast, pretty much the same thing. So I'll take a spreadsheet, I'll do a whole bunch of research trying to find guests about specific topics. So I think about like the topics of conversation for each podcast. And then I will find the guests related to that topic and then I'll pitch them and then we do it like through that way. So there's a lot of ways to do it, but what I find the most helpful is doing it in batches first, because the more that you can send out, then you can follow up and then you can book yourself out for a few weeks and then you're not really scrambling for more guests, more content. But I think if you put like, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours a month aside to looking specifically for guests, like you could find some really cool guests and book them in quite quickly.
And what role do you believe vulnerability and authenticity play in creating meaningful conversations with your audience through podcasting?
I think there's a really powerful spot that we sit in when we can come from vulnerability. And something that I heard recently was speak from the scar, not the wound. So, whatever you're going to do, make sure that you're approaching it from the lens of you being ready to talk about whatever specific thing you're going to talk about. And I really value personally vulnerability. I value being able to make a connection with someone. I feel like when you can let your walls come down just a little bit, and it doesn't mean you have to overshare every single thing about your life, but when you can let your walls come down just a little bit and create that like warm environment for your listener, but also for your guest, then people are more eager to share. When I do Happiness Happens, the number one thing I hear all the time from the guests that I interview is, oh my God, that was so much fun. And it's because I approach it the same way that you approach this conversation today. Like, hey, how are you? Are you having a nice day? I can't wait to get into this conversation. It's so nice to meet you. Like those are things that instantly make your guest feel comfortable, right? And so thinking about whether it's with a client, whether it's with family or friends, a guest on a podcast, how can you create that sense of like warmth within yourself, which leads to more vulnerability, more open conversation, more kindness, without giving away your whole life, you know?
Mm. I think that's like
Yeah.
so important when you're hosting, you kind of set the tone. So it's like really important that you kind of like have an inviting energy if you want the
Yeah.
guests to be just as vulnerable as the host, I guess.
Exactly. Exactly.
And podcasting is becoming increasingly popular. What sets apart like a successful podcast from the rest? Is it the host? Is it the way they market the podcast? Is it their technical setup? What is it exactly?
Honestly, I would say I feel like people will go to tech right away and be like, oh, the backdrop has to be pretty or the this, or that, and whatever. And like, yeah, those things matter and they're important. Like, of course, you want your set to like look nice when you're doing it. And again, I'm saying this with my set being like probably the most boring set that I've ever had as a background ever. But that's okay. But what I really think sets it apart is the content that's in it, and then paired with the marketing of the show. If you don't talk about your podcast, how do you expect people to watch it, listen to it, or whatever? So if you're not talking about your own show, why do you expect other people to be talking about your own show? And then finding those like really cool moments within your podcast are also, I think, really important. And then taking those and like sharing them online. Like, how do you lead people in? How do you hook people in? How do you get them excited for what it is that you're creating? So I think it's a combo between the content that you're creating and then also the way that you're sharing it online. If it looks boring and drab, people are gonna be like, I don't think so. I think I'm good, you know? But taking like care and like attention to like actually produce it, like put effort into it, especially if it's a reflection of you. Your show, whether you're doing it for personal or business, is an extension of who you are as a person or as a brand or as a business. You want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward.
And how do you keep your content fresh and keep the audiences engaged and interested over time?
With Happiness Happens, I've changed the direction of the show so many times. And I think it's really important to like tap into what you want to do intuitively. Like if you feel like having a specific conversation, have that conversation, right? When your interests start to change, your show is allowed to change also. The more you let the evolution of things flow and like, let your own self like transform, there's so much magic that happens from that place. In terms of like the social media side, I mean, of course, like we'll hop on trends and making sure that, we're marketing things from like a bit of a different perspective too. For Happiness Happens, it is more of a lifestyle brand. So sometimes I'll throw in like my own personal content and, things that are not just podcast related. And same thing with as it relates to podcasting, it's part of a production company. So that'll be like alongside different tips and things like that within the podcast industry. So I think that from a content point of view, like change up your graphics, use something different. People don't want to see the same thing over and over and over again. And like you can make changes, and sometimes changes are really good.
And as a entrepreneur and podcast host, how do you balance your various roles and responsibilities effectively?
I've been thinking about this idea of like balance and like, does it even actually exist? And I've kind of concluded that balance isn't really something that can be compartmentalized. We all want this idea of balance, but the truth is, I know for myself as an entrepreneur, sometimes there's just things that need to be done, and they just need to be done, and it has to get done, and there's seasons, right? So I would say like if you're in a slower, more calm season, like embrace that and enjoy that. If you're in a more busy and chaotic season, be there for that and roll with it. One thing that I've learned and that has been really helpful, I guess, for me while I'm going through and like doing all the things we do every single day, I have a checklist that I have in Trello. So Trello is a project management system, and it's like a templated card in Trello that I create a new card every single week. And in that templated card has all of the things that I need to do every like Monday to Sunday for the business specifically, like for client work specifically. So I know exactly what I'm doing every single day. So I think that when you can set your week up and know exactly what you're going to be doing every day, you leave the end of each day feeling like productive, and then setting that list up and making sure that list is accurate and good to go for the following day, for me, helps me like shut my brain off and move into something different. Another thing, I don't know if you're listening right now, if you can relate to this, but I used to work from the couch a lot, but then I found that it would like make me actually more stressed out, because then my couch turned into like my office, and then my office was my office, and then my couch was my office. Like then like it felt like my whole house was my office. And so like having dedicated spaces for things, and like not, even though it's like so much fun and like it's great, like try not to like work in bed, try not to work from the couch, because then it just feels like your whole life is just work. So that's been helpful for me, is having like spaces, dedicated spaces to do work.
I love that. I've always listened to that advice, like having dedicated spaces, like if you're
Yeah,
whether you're studying, working, eating, like just put it in one place. Otherwise, whenever you go there, you're just constantly going to think of that thing. And so it's like you said,
exactly.
it'll keep stressing you out. But
Exactly.
after every podcast, whether it's for your show or for another company, what makes you say that was a successful episode?
Oh, I feel like it's an intuition thing, but I really value when I'm on a podcast and someone says to me like, "Oh my goodness, that was so much fun. I really enjoyed that." That to me, I'm like, "Okay, cool." Like the other day, I was interviewing someone yesterday and we stopped recording and she said to me, "Oh my goodness, your questions are so thoughtful." And she's like, "Your questions actually matter." And I was like, "Oh," I was like, "Well, that's a really nice compliment." And I was like, "Wow," I was like, "Hey, that was really good." But I think that when you as a host can hold space for a conversation and be able to dive into different areas, like different nitty-gritty places without making the guests feel uncomfortable or like they need to overshare, that I feel like is a good interview. When you get a different perspective of something different than they would typically share. Which, for example, this whole entire podcast, I've shared things that I wouldn't typically share because of you and what your energy is like. And so like it's a good thing, right? So you get a different side of someone when you can get past someone's. Okay, so I'll give you another example. I interviewed someone. He has a couple 100,000 followers, and it was an interview for his book, and it was such a good conversation. And so I said to him beforehand, I said, "We're going to talk about your book, obviously, because I want to talk about your book, but I want to understand more about happiness and like what happiness means to you." And he was like, "Okay." And so I could tell in the beginning that he was trying to stay like on script, and he was trying to stay like on topic or whatever. But I kept asking questions that would dive into different areas. So like, don't be afraid to ask questions that dive into different areries. He ended up messaging me afterwards and he said, "That was an incredible interview. I really loved your questions, blah, blah, blah." He left me a rating and a review on the podcast. And like, it's just like, so don't be afraid to like, if you feel like asking a different question than what's written down, do that because that's where you get the most like authentic answers from.
You know what? I'm going to take your advice right now and just ask you, because you seem to ask this to your guests, like, what does happiness mean to you?
I love that. I love that. So that is the first question that I ask every single guest that comes on my podcast. Did you know that?
No.
Oh my God, that's so funny. Yeah, that's literally the first episode, the first question that I'll ask anyone that comes onto my show. I ask them, "What does happiness mean to you?" And for me, happiness means inner peace. And inner peace is found through how we live our lives every day, how we show up in our friendships and relationships and with clients and business and whatever, how we treat people, how we want to be treated, right? The kindness that we extend to other people. Like for me, happiness, and I feel like I'm in my happiness when I'm in like my own inner peace and there's no inner turmoil. Regardless of what else is happening in my life, even though like sad things can be happening, there's always a way to have peace, even with those things that are maybe more sad. So that's my definition.
I love that. And speaking of thoughtful questions, could you share any tips or best practices for effective podcasting, hosting, and interviewing?
Yes. So, one key thing that I think is really important is having an anchor to end your podcast because a lot of the times people are like, "I don't know how to end this interview," or like, "I feel like it's been going on for too long," or, they've already shared where I can connect with them and like we're still talking. And it's like, okay, like, how do I wrap this up? I like to have an anchor question at the end. So, I know in my mind that when I'm interviewing someone, the structure that I'm going to do it is, we're going to finish up like, the conversation where it feels like a natural break. Then I'll say, "Okay, can you share with my listener, where they can find you?" And then they'll say it. And I'll say, actually, let me backtrack there. I'll say, "Before I ask you my last question, can you please tell my audience where they can find you?" So then they'll share that. And then my anchor question for happiness happens is, what's one way you can create a little more happiness in your day, every day, starting today? And then they'll answer that question. And then I say, "Okay, that's amazing. Thank you so much." And then they'll say, "Thank you again." And then I will look to the camera and then I just close it out because I know that's my cue. We're done with the interview. Unless like it's something like really sparks out from that, from what they're saying. I think also too is when I first started interviewing people, I used to get so excited about what they were saying that I would like talk over them all the time. Don't do that. Give people space to talk. When you're done your thought, pause, let people pick up where you leave off. You can edit it, even if it feels awkward or whatever, you can edit it or whatever. But I think that it's just really important to like give people the space to uh, finish their thought, to finish their conversation. And of course, then you have people who ramble sometimes too much. So try and find that natural break in there too.
Oh,
I feel like I kind of rambled a lot in this podcast, but that's okay. But yeah, so you want that natural break, but then you also want people to be able to finish the thought that they have so that they can give all of the information to the listener, because a lot of the times we cut people off right before it gets to the good part. So
I yeah, definitely agree. And we
mhm.
were talking earlier about like getting over your fear, right? But after that happens, so you get over the fear. How do you handle now negative feedback, criticism, both personally and professionally in the podcasting sphere?
You know, I think about this often because I feel like I live a life that is way more unconventional than most people. Like I don't really follow, societal rules. I don't really live my life in the way that most people do. And I think the first thing is like you just got to be good with that and you just have to know that like people are not going to understand, but it's also not their job to, and it's not your job to make them understand. And I really think about this, especially a lot lately. Do I really want to be taking advice or criticism from someone that I would never want to be in their shoes? Right. So a lot of the times people who judge us or people who are not kind or people who have a lot of thoughts, yes, they can be coming from a place of love, especially if it's a family member and, there can always be concern and that kind of stuff. But I really think about, would this person ever want to like live their life in the same way as me? If the answer is no, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like their opinion, their thought, while appreciated, doesn't matter. And that takes a long time, in my opinion, to get to of this place of like, detachment, if you will. But and it's so convoluted because I feel like I still go through this like all the time. But at the end of the day, people who are going to be judgmental, people who are going to be negative, people who are going to talk badly about you are people that are either jealous or they wish that they could do what you were doing. You know what I mean? And so it's like I try and take it as like, thanks for the concern, but like I'm good. And I'm going to keep doing what feels right to me. As long as you're in integrity with yourself and that you're being respectful and kind, then I think that's the only thing that matters. That's for me. Anyways, that's the only thing that matters.
Yeah, I think it's always so necessary to hear these thoughts because I
Yeah,
feel like no one who has gone through the struggle or who got over the cringe is ever going to make fun of someone who's still trying, right? It's always like
exactly.
the people who, you know, let's say haters haven't
Yeah,
gone through that process. So they don't understand. So,
exactly. And it's like, okay, but why make fun of someone who's trying to do something different in life? Like
mhm,
life is meant to be enjoyed and explored and try new things and just test something. Like you have no idea how your life can change. We look at our lives through this lens of where we are today, but you have no idea what your life is going to look like in 6 months from now. And all it takes is for you to just choose a different thought, choose a different choice, and to not pay so much attention or so much care to what other people think that you're doing right or wrong in your life. Like unless someone said this to me recently, like unless they're paying your bills, their opinion shouldn't matter. And like
mhm,
I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm like that actually is very tangible for me. Like you're not paying my bills, so like why are you telling me how to live my life?
it's not worth the time of day. Well, what advice would you give to aspiring podcasters who want to start their own shows but don't know where to begin?
Am I allowed to am I allowed to plug my free resource? Because I feel like that's a
Absolutely.
okay,
Yes.
because I was gonna say I feel like that's a really good spot to start because honestly, it's a checklist. It's an 8-week checklist that takes you through the entire process of starting and getting your podcast from like in your mind to actually started. So I would start there. But then the other thing I would say too is like don't get too caught up in all of like the nitty-gritty. Things can change. Like when I started Happiness Happens, I did not have video. I didn't have a set. I didn't have like half of the things, although video wasn't really like as big as it is now back then. But you can always add. So it's like, what is the path to least resistance, and what is the way that you can do it in the way that's most aligned to you? So yeah, so I would say go download my guide because it will be really helpful to you, and then also just start, and one foot in front of the other, and just keep going.
I'm going to make sure all of those resources will be available. I'll be linking that in our
Mhm.
description. And how do you see the future of podcasting evolving and what
Mm.
trends do you anticipate in the coming years?
Ooh, I really like this question. So definitely a lot more on the AI side. We're already seeing, AI based podcasts and all that kind of stuff. Do I agree with them? Honestly, no, but that's not here nor there. I think that video is going to continue to be something that's really like prominent and that's really out there. But what I think is going to set things apart is that vulnerability piece and being able to speak from your heart and like relate to your audience instead of, there's a way that you can teach and that you can inspire other people while feeling like everyone is on the same level of humanity, if you will. You know what I mean? Like sometimes if you think about, someone who's teaching something, it can feel like there's like a barrier in between. But I think the more that you can break down that barrier, and the more you can find ways to be relatable to the people that are listening to your content, that will resonate the most. And also, we're going to see a lot more, I think, on like the micro content influencer or content creator, because everyone has that at their fingertips now, right? And especially if you have a podcast, that's something that you can do right away. And so everyone has a message that they can share. Just make sure that the quality of your message is there too.
And before I let you go, I'd like to ask this to everyone. What are the vibes looking like in the future? What legacy do you hope to leave through your podcasting and entrepreneurship? And what do you aspire to achieve in the near future or ahead?
I love this so much. Okay, first of all, vibes are going to be real strong and real good. I am really excited for all of the things that are going to come, that are going to happen. I'm excited to speak on more stages. I'm really excited to build out the Happiness Happens brand even more. I took a little bit of a backseat in building out that brand over the last little bit because I focused on building out the production company first, like more, and so I'm really excited to like create. I'm really excited to continue to build and try new things and launch new products, launch new services, and just really see like where life takes me and like where it goes. Another really cool thing that I just love is being a woman producer in this space, because there's not a whole lot of us. There's a lot of, VAs and podcast managers and stuff like that, but like full blown, like actual producers, we're starting to see more of them, which is exciting. But I want Volt to be a household name. Like I want Volt to be the name that people think about when they think about podcasting. So manifesting more awards, more speaking opportunities, TEDx talks, being on stages, building new businesses, traveling, living. That's it.
I love that. Sending good vibes your way. I definitely see you
Thanks.
making that happen. And before you go, is there anything you'd like to leave a message to our listeners? Maybe you want to plug any of your other services? Anything.
Yeah, sure. So if you want to get in contact, please do send me a message on Instagram. It's at Simona with 2 underscores Costantini, or you can find me at Volt Productions, VOLT Productions.co. So we can chat there about all things podcasting. If you're already a podcaster, I have a membership for podcasters where I share different resources every single week. Things to help you monetize your show, grow your show, launch your show, pitch decks, media kits, like all literally like editing tutorials. Like it's so packed with resources, and it's only $27 a month. So please join me over there. And I'm going to end this podcast episode with a thought that I always say on Happiness Happens. And I hope that when you hear it, like you just think of like the magic and the possibility of life. But what I end Happiness Happens with is happiness happens when you're least expecting it. And so I hope today that you can really just think that, happiness happens when you're least expecting it, and life can surprise you when you least expect it.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Simona, for being here, for taking the time to grace our podcast and sharing your wisdom with our listeners. And of course, thank you to everyone who listened to us today. This has been your host, Patricia. And remember, for all your professional business and technical writing needs, there's only one way to go, and that's with the right direction. See you guys soon. Goodbye.